Did you know that the USA can print money without the help and approval of the US Central Bank? Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, will be the main player here. This is now being revealed.
Both of these programs require no input from the Fed, no input from Congress. They can implement them as and when they please.
These financial instruments could be used at any time without the approval of the Federal Reserve. In just about 24 hours, the next potential trigger event will take place here, according to Arthur Hayes, which we need to watch closely. Scott Bessent mentioned in an interview a week or two ago that he has enough tools at his disposal to stimulate the market, independent of the Federal Reserve. And according to Arthur Hayes, this is what will happen next. And we need to watch very closely what the Treasury Department does here. This will massively pump the Bitcoin price upwards.
But if the Treasury is going to print $2.5 trillion, shit's going up.
Donald Trump has been trying for a very long time to get the Federal Reserve to print money, lower interest rates, do QE, and so on. Arthur Hayes is now talking about how in this Bitcoin cycle, more creative and different ways might be found to print money, rather than using the traditional methods. Those can still be used, but they will only be used at the very end of the cycle. I've talked about this in other videos as well about shadow QE, and that's exactly what this is about now. Arthur Hayes is uncovering massive things here. Let's take a look at his highly explosive new interview.
So there's lots of things that you can do that aren't quantitative easing, because that's a bad word. The plebs know what quantitative easing is. They know that means inflation. You can't do that anymore. You got to be more creative.
It's already the QE game and so on. By now, everyone knows it. Now, people want to take more creative measures because the optimum is for the central bank or the state to print money without people even noticing or without it being labeled as money printing.
So I think we have to be flexible in our mental models of what quantitative easing means, what money printing means. Look at the second order and third order effects of, okay, well, if they do this, how do the other market participants react? Do they buy more bonds? Do they move money from a sterilized pool on some central bank balance sheet into the general market, which can be releveraged through the banking system?
When he said, we simply need to free ourselves a bit in our mental model, the classic money printing. They will also find new ways in this cycle to pump money into the economy, into the market, and to bring liquidity. Classically, money printing is simple, defined as the US central bank buying government bonds that no one else buys on the open market. That's what it's called. QE programs, quantitative easing. But there are also other means that also bring liquidity into the market. It doesn't even have to be from the central bank. It can also be from the Treasury Department. And that still brings additional liquidity into the market, for example, by changing banking regulations so that banks are incentivized to hold more government bonds, or by perhaps forcing other nations to buy US government bonds. This naturally also brings more liquidity into the market. This is also an exciting alternative, or he has a very, very interesting alternative, which is the TGA, the Treasury Federal Account. This is something like the savings bank of the USA. And when more liquidity is released into the market from the savings bank, and the Treasury Federal Account is currently well filled, then a massive amount of liquidity will be pumped into the market again, but this time not by the Fed, but by the Treasury Department. And the crazy thing is here that Alpha Hayes says the next data, where now here, if you need to pay attention, here she says, the quarterly refund account of the US Treasury Department falls on the 28th and the 30th. So here, possibly in just about 24 hours, depending on when you watch the video, if you see it early in the morning, it will probably be announced sometime in the evening, US time on the 28th. Yes, it might not be a full 24 hours, it might only be 12 hours. Then I also misspoke at the beginning, I meant 24 hours, so it's probably maybe 8 hours, 12 hours, 10 hours, whatever. Also depends on when you watch the video. Arthur Hayes simply says in the tweet, if the Treasury sells fewer bonds or releases more money from the TGA account, then the available dollar liquidity in the financial system increases, which means an additional stimulus. And that's not money printing in the classical sense, but still, liquidity injection, and what can still be considered as money printing. And something like that is, of course, very, very good for Bitcoin. I mean, it still takes time for it to be reflected in the Bitcoin price. We know, for example, that liquidity always has a 90-day delay before it might be reflected in the Bitcoin price, sometimes even longer. So that doesn't mean that Bitcoin will rise immediately. And it also doesn't mean that it is being announced here that the TGA account will be completely emptied. But rather, these are just possible dates here on the 28th. And the 30th, when this could be announced. Another possibility would be that the Treasury directly buys US government bonds, not the Fed, but the Treasury itself does it. We'll get to that later, but really take in the highly sensitive statements here.
So we have to be a little bit more, I guess, indirect in our thinking of how the quantity of money changes as Treasury officials all across the world sort of take control from the central banks. Because the central banker says, I want to be independent. I care about the value of the fiat currency, blah, 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 right? And that's what they believe. But the Treasury official says, this government's broke. The politicians want to spend the money. I work for the politicians. Therefore, I will make sure the government can fund itself at an affordable level.
Most important point that one must understand. Because on one side, there's the Fed, and as he says here, they want to remain independent. Jerome Powell has also been leaked, apparently having something against Donald Trump. There was that insider leak from the Fed insider who, check out the videos, I made a video about it, where he clearly said, yes, Jerome Powell wants to build his legacy by giving Donald Trump a hard time. And they want to be independent, they want to have price stability under control or at least in sight. But the people here, the Treasury officials, they just want to finance the state, they want to keep the point system going here. And that's why there will be a shift away from the Fed, moving more and more, relying less on the Fed and more on the Ministry of Finance, on the Treasury officials, as he says here. And they are, of course, subordinate to the state here. And that's also what Donald Trump tried to do, to remove Jerome Powell and put someone in place who is subordinate to the state, where Donald Trump directly has control. If it doesn't work, then according to Arthur Hayes, Scott Bessent will start printing money. The US Treasury will start printing money. This won't be declared as money printing, but it will be labeled differently. And it's a very, very exciting story that's unfolding here, that potentially this bull run could be triggered by other mechanisms, not directly by the central bank, but by the Treasury. And then only in the second step could the Fed come into play.
We all were very well trained from 2008 to 2019 that the Fed does QE. It prints money every week to buy bonds. Stock market goes up, right? Just that was the game. We got conditioned. Where's the QE? Stock market goes up. Bitcoin goes up. Everything goes up, right?
So he's talking about how we are conditioned, simply used to the Federal Reserve printing money, doing QE, stock markets going up, Bitcoin going up, and so on.
And so post 2020, after the little bit of inflation that the world experienced and every central bank raised rates, the community was like, okay, well, we know QE equals number go up. So where's the QE? And from 2022 until the current moment, Powell really, they cut a few times, but we haven't seen, and quantitative tightening was reduced a bit, but we haven't seen a 2008 to 2019 style quantitative easing program from the Fed. And that's left a lot of people saying, oh no, the Fed's being really, really tight, therefore I can't buy risk assets. So I'm going to sit on the sidelines and I don't know what you do.
He's talking here about the massive Bitcoin explosion catalyst. In 2018, it was QE by the Fed. In 2020, it was QE by the Fed. And now there's no QE. Okay, now the QE is being slightly eased. But he says that a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines and will only come back into the market, going into risk assets, which, in my opinion, Bitcoin is not. Many in the market define Bitcoin as a risk asset. They will only come back here. When they see QE here again, when they see the central bank starting to pump massive amounts of money into the market again. And it's just another price driver that's still lurking in the background.
Because you're not in Bitcoin, you're not in NASDAQ, you're not in these things. Now, obviously, that was the wrong trait because people forgot about the other side of the equation of what can the Treasury do unilaterally without the Fed. And so we've learned, Yellen, bad girl Yellen, or some staffer at the Treasury Department said, oh, there's $2.5 trillion sitting in this reverse repo program that doesn't really circulate within the economy. How do we get that money to come out of the reverse repo and into these bonds that we need to sell because we have a large deficit?
The reverse repo is a financial tool that helps manage liquidity by temporarily removing money from the market. This process allows us to redirect funds into purchasing government bonds, which are crucial for financing government spending. Given our large deficit, selling these bonds is essential to raise the necessary funds. These bonds serve as secure investments and help stabilize the economy by addressing liquidity needs. What you would use money for here is to buy government bonds to essentially increase liquidity. And that's what he says you need to keep in mind. Just because the Fed isn't doing QE yet, just because the Fed isn't lowering interest rates now, doesn't mean there aren't potential massive money injection programs coming up. And that's simply the big warning he's giving here. And he already sees the go-ahead given here, which means he already sees the indicator that this money printing will take place, or rather, that the starting signal has already been given.
And therefore, liquidity goes up, stock market goes up, right? Now, Powell's over here doing his I'm a Paul Volcker, impersonation. I'm going to go and keep these monetary conditions tight. I really care about fighting inflation. On the other hand, Yellen just printed $2.5 trillion.
Back then, Paul didn't want to print money. He wanted to act tough. Obey Babu, saying, hey, no, we're focusing on monetary stability here. And then Janet Yellen simply started the money printing press through the Treasury Department. And now Scott Base and Lord Art for Hayes will do the same. And this will naturally lead to a massive takeoff.
But not really printed. It's not technically quantitative easing. And so people get caught up on this, oh, it's not QE, so the market's not going to go up. Yeah, but it's still released at $2.5 trillion into the market.
So exactly what I told you before, that people get upset saying, yeah, that's not official money printing and so on. But you shouldn't let that drive you crazy, because it doesn't matter whether it's called QE or the Treasury bill program or whatever, or where the money comes from. As long as money is flowing into the market, as long as government bonds are being purchased, this is not taken over by the free market, but somehow through coercion or some other money shifting and manipulation measures take place. It leads to simply more liquidity in the market. And that causes stock markets, Bitcoin, and so on to explode upwards.
So that was a September 2022 until sort of early 2025 situation. And that was a monster rally. And Bitcoin went up 6x in that period of time.
Bitcoin increased sixfold in the market without any QE here, but driven by the Treasury, as per RFA.
So focusing on what Powell is doing was correct in the last cycle, but now it's a Treasury show. The Treasury runs the show. They dictate policy. So what do we get out of the new Secretary Bessent's mouth recently? He sat down with a Bloomberg interviewer, I think it was on April 11th or 12th, in the heat of the moment, and said, and the interviewer asked him, well, Powell's keeping tight monetary policy. What do you guys have any tools at the Treasury to help market conditions? And he said, I've got plenty of tools, specifically Treasury buybacks.
And this is really the essence that I wanted to share with you here with the video. Arthur Hayes actually says that this could now become a Treasury show, meaning a finance ministry show, and the next Bitcoin price increases might not be a central bank show, maybe only in the second phase, then a central bank show. He also reiterates what you said before. Scott Bessent already mentioned in an interview that he has plenty of tools here. So he has a lot of tools that he could still use here. There are probably also a few tools that we haven't even talked about yet. Or, such people are often very, very creative when it comes to corrupting the system, when it comes to building Ponzi schemes and so on. It's always very, very interesting that people become really, really creative. In any case, this is all a very, very good signal here for Bitcoin. You really have to look at more than just the central bank here. That's actually the very, very important message you can take away from this. Write me in the comments below how you see the whole thing. Are you prepared? Do you also see Scott Bessent here as a main player who will contribute to pumping the markets up? And if you want to buy Bitcoin, if you want to prepare yourself here, I'll put a link below for you. 21 Bitcoin, where you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. Here you can use the code Bitcoin Share and even get up to 20% when buying Bitcoin. It's super easy, super simple for beginners, intermediates, and pros. No matter what level you're at, folks. Peace out.